3:10 in the morning, August 21, 1942. The northern coastline of Guadalcanal lay in total darkness. The jungle behind the beach breathed with humidity so thick it felt solid against the skin. Insects filled the air with a sound that had not changed in 10,000 years. The mouth of the creek the Marines had named Alligator Creek lay silent, its narrow sandbar stretching barely 50 feet across. On the far side of that sandbar, 917 men of the Imperial Japanese Army's Ichiki detachment crouched in the undergrowth, weapons ready, waiting for the order to charge. Their colonel had made them a promise. Tonight, he said, the Americans would run. He was wrong, and the consequences of that wrongness would reach across every island in the Pacific for the next 3 years. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was not an ordinary officer. 5 years earlier, serving as a major commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Infantry Regiment of the China Garrison Army near Beijing, he had led the Japanese unit whose night training exercise near the Marco Polo Bridge in July of 1937 triggered the incident that started the Second Sino-Japanese War. He had led men through some of the most brutal urban combat in China in the years that followed. He was confident, experienced, and absolutely certain he understood his enemy. He had described United States Marines to his staff, in words recorded by witnesses and preserved in official American records, as effeminate and cowardly. His planning diary, seized on the battlefield after the fight, contained an entry for August 21 that read simply, "Enjoyment of the fruit of victory." He had already written the ending before the battle began. The Ichiki detachment was built around a reinforced battalion of the 28th Infantry Regiment, 7th Division, recruited from Asahikawa in Hokkaido. 917 soldiers had been put ashore at Taivu Point 2 nights earlier by 6 destroyers, operating under Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's Destroyer Squadron 2. They had originally been earmarked for the cancelled Japanese invasion of Midway. When American Marines landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, and seized the nearly completed Japanese airfield, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo redirected Ichiki to retake it immediately. His intelligence briefing at Rabaul told him the American beachhead held perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 men, possibly preparing to withdraw. He believed he was walking into a withdrawing force, demoralized and under strength. The actual garrison under Major General Alexander Vandergrift was the 1st Marine Division, nearly 11,000 men, dug into a careful defensive perimeter around what they had renamed Henderson Field. Ichiki did not know this. His superiors had not told him. His doctrine did not require him to believe it was possible. The United States Marine Corps that waited behind those machine guns in the darkness was something Japanese military planners had never genuinely studied. The Corps traced its institutional roots to November 10, 1775, but the fighting force that arrived in the Pacific in 1942 had been rebuilt from the ground up between the 2 world wars into something the Japanese had no vocabulary to describe. Major General John Lejeune had served as commandant from 1920 to 1929 and had spent his entire tenure transforming a colonial constabulary into a precision amphibious assault force. He demanded physical standards that eliminated the weak and marksmanship standards that left no Marine uncertain about the one fundamental thing he would always be asked to do. He demanded a culture of initiative at the lowest levels of the organization that set the Corps apart from every conventional army of its generation. He described the relationship between officers and enlisted Marines not as that of commander and subordinate, but as that of teacher and student, a framing unusual in any military institution of the early 20th century and nearly unthinkable in the Imperial Japanese Army. The doctrine those Marines eventually carried into battle had been written not by a committee, but by a man who could not stop thinking about Japan. Lieutenant Colonel Earl Ellis had served in the Pacific, studied the island chains Japan had taken from Germany after the First World War, and in 1921 produced a classified planning document titled Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia. Ellis predicted, with extraordinary precision, that the United States and Japan would go to war in the Pacific, and that the central challenge would be forcing amphibious landings across fortified coral reefs on hostile tropical islands in the face of determined defenders. He named many of the actual battle sites more than 20 years before Americans died there. He identified Saipan, the Marshalls, the Carolines, and the Palos as key objectives. Ellis died on the island of Koror in the Japanese-administered Palau Islands in May of 1923. The cause of his death remains uncertain, though available evidence points to illness rather than the intelligence plot that legend later attributed to Japanese agents. His plan survived him, was quietly adopted at Quantico, and became the intellectual foundation of Marine Corps amphibious doctrine for the next 2 decades. That doctrine was formally codified in the Tentative Manual for Landing Operations, published by the Marine Corps schools in 1934, and adopted by the Navy as official fleet publication FTP 167 in August of 1938, then by the Army 2 years after that. It was the first serious published doctrine for amphibious assault in any navy in the world. It addressed in precise terms how to coordinate naval gunfire support, carrier airstrikes, logistics over the beach, casualty evacuation, and infantry assault across defended shorelines under direct fire. It accounted for the fact that landing craft would be slow, exposed, and vulnerable. No Japanese planning manual of that period addressed how to stop what that document described. The Marines who trained on these ideas rehearsed 7 large-scale amphibious exercises between 1935 and 1941 at places like Culebra in the Caribbean and New River in North Carolina. They practiced communications between ships, aircraft, and infantry on beaches that were actively hostile. They worked out shore fire control parties, the small teams that would call naval gunfire onto specific targets while bullets came at them from behind sand ridges. They drilled a culture of small unit initiative. A platoon whose lieutenant had been killed was expected to keep moving under a sergeant, and a squad whose sergeant had been killed was expected to keep moving under a corporal. This bottom-up flexibility was something Japanese officers, trained in a command culture where authority flowed strictly downward, found genuinely difficult to model or predict. There was another dimension to the Marine identity that Japanese intelligence almost entirely missed. The Corps had spent 30 years between the wars, not in garrison but in small wars across the Caribbean and Central America, in Haiti, in Nicaragua, in the Dominican Republic, and in China. The Small Wars Manual, published in 1940, distilled 3 decades of irregular fighting into a practical guide for judgment, under conditions no training manual had precisely anticipated. It emphasized adaptability, cultural awareness, improvised logistics, and the maintenance of tactical pressure against an enemy who did not fight by conventional rules. Marines who had served in Nicaragua in the 1920s knew how to move through jungle without roads. Marines who had served in Haiti knew how to hold a defended perimeter through a dark tropical night. Marines who had served in the international settlement in Shanghai knew how to maintain combat discipline in close quarters against an enemy willing to take heavy casualties. None of this background appeared in Japanese intelligence assessments. None of it was accounted for in the plans that sent Colonel Ichiki across that sandbar. There was also the matter of what the Marine Corps meant to the United States as a national institution. By late 1940, with mobilization underway, the Corps had grown from under 20,000 men to nearly 28,000 and was expanding rapidly. Its identity in American public life was outsized relative to its size, built through decades of recruiting and a cultivated idea that Marines were volunteers who had chosen a harder path. The training at Parris Island in South Carolina and at the recruit depot in San Diego was designed not merely to produce soldiers, but to produce a specific identity, one that defined itself through willingness to endure and to close with the enemy under the most difficult possible conditions. The Japanese military had observed this reputation from a distance and classified it as propaganda. They had not correctly assessed what happens to an institution when every individual in it has voluntarily chosen to be there and has survived a training process specifically designed to eliminate those who will not hold when holding is. The hardest available option. The difference between a conscript who fights because he has been ordered to and a volunteer who fights because he has defined his identity around doing so is not a small one. Japanese military planners had no doctrinal category for it, and no way of accounting for its effect on what Marines did when they ran out of options on a defended sandbar or a coral ridge. The Imperial Japanese Army that faced these men had built its identity on an entirely different foundation. The field service regulations stated plainly that offensive spirit was inherently superior to defensive firepower and demanded that soldiers attack even when tactical analysis recommended the opposite. They promoted Saishin, spiritual willpower, as a practical battlefield force multiplier. Officers at all levels were taught that moral courage could overcome material inferiority. The United States Army's own intelligence handbook on Japanese military forces, published in 1944, noted this directly, observing that Japanese doctrine insisted on the inherent superiority of the offense, and that Japanese officers frequently made attack decisions in situations where orthodox tactics plainly called for defense. Layered beneath the tactical doctrine was a racial assumption that Japanese military planners had been building for more than a decade. Assessments circulated within the army before the Guadalcanal campaign characterized Western soldiers as spiritually fragile, as men who disliked fighting in rain, mist, or darkness, as men whose national character made them unsuited for the sustained sacrifice that Japan's warrior tradition demanded of its own soldiers. Imperial General Headquarters had told senior commanders, in a formulation that surviving Japanese staff officers confirmed after the war, that once a Japanese landing force established itself ashore, the Marines would surrender. This was not a casual remark. It was an operational assumption embedded in planning timelines and force allocations. It explained why Ichiki was sent with 917 men rather than 9,000. It explained why Kawaguchi was given 6,000 rather than 60,000. The assumption was not revised after Tenaru. It was not revised after Edson's Ridge. It was not revised until Japanese commanders in their tunnels and caves were watching Marines absorb 50 and 60% casualties in a single regiment and continue pressing forward, and by then revising the assumption no longer changed the outcome. That assumption walked into a wall of machine gun fire in the early hours of August 21, 1942. The days before the attack had proceeded with a confidence that should have alarmed any careful observer. On August 19th, a Marine patrol under Captain Charles Brush had intercepted and nearly destroyed a 34-man Japanese reconnaissance party moving along the coastal trail toward Henderson Field. The Marines recovered maps and documents from the Japanese dead that confirmed Ichiki's planned route, his approximate strength, and his general timeline. The Marine intelligence officer found the captured maps sobering, as they showed defensive positions with a level of accuracy that reflected careful prior surveillance. The Marines adjusted their positions and tightened their fields of fire. That same day, a retired sergeant major of the Solomon Islands Protectorate Armed Constabulary, named Jacob Vuza, was captured by Japanese soldiers near the eastern perimeter. Japanese soldiers found a small American flag on his person and suspected him of spying. They beat him and bayoneted him repeatedly, in the throat, the chest, and the shoulder. They bound him to a tree with cord and left him for dead. Vuza freed himself, crawled approximately 3 miles through the jungle, reached the Marine perimeter at some point during the night, and delivered a warning before he could no longer speak. He survived his wounds, and was later awarded the Silver Star by General Vandergrift, and eventually made an honorary sergeant major of the Marine Corps. His warning, combined with the documents from the Brush Patrol, left Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, with a clear picture of what was coming. Pre-registered artillery waited behind the infantry line. Interlocking machine guns covered the sandbar from multiple angles. The Marines were ready. Ichiki had performed no personal ground reconnaissance of the Marine position before attacking. He had not requested aerial photographs of the objective. He had not waited for the second echelon of his regiment, still at sea on transport vessels. Somewhere between 11 at night and 3 in the morning, he launched a frontal assault across the sandbar, bayonets fixed. Screaming across 50 feet of open sand, illuminated only by starlight and the muzzle flashes that began the instant they were visible. The Marine machine guns opened at effective range. The killing was catastrophic and immediate. Successive waves entered the same corridor and suffered the same result. A flanking column waded into the surf to the north, attempting to bypass the sandbar, and was caught in the water. The Japanese pressed the assault for hours with consistent ferocity, feeding men into the same positions through the same darkness, unable to adapt their tactics, unable to identify a point of weakness in the Marine line. At dawn, Vandergrift launched a counterstroke. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 1st Battalion crossed the river upstream and moved to envelop the surviving Japanese from the south. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks of Company B, 1st Tank Battalion, crossed from the Marine side onto the sandbar. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis of the International News Service, present with the Marine Command element, described the tanks moving through the surviving Japanese defenders pivoting and turning among the coconut trees, systematically eliminating pockets of resistance in language his editors found necessary to soften before publication. By late afternoon, organized Japanese resistance had ceased to exist. Approximately 800 Japanese soldiers were dead. 34 Marines had been killed and 75 wounded. 15 Japanese prisoners were taken. Whether Ichiki burned his regimental colors and killed himself, or died fighting in the final moments of the battle, remains disputed between American and Japanese sources. What is certain is that he did not survive, and that his force had been effectively destroyed. His radio message to Rabaul, transmitted in the final hours, described the detachment as having been annihilated at a point short of the airfield. The operations officer at 17th Army in Rabaul, who received the message, initially dismissed it as a false report. The doctrine had told him this could not happen. Rear Admiral Tanaka, who had delivered Ichiki's men and who went on to become one of the most capable Japanese surface warfare commanders of the entire war, wrote an assessment after the war that has appeared in every serious historical account of Guadalcanal. He called the result a tragedy, and wrote that it should have taught Japan the hopelessness of what he called bamboo spear tactics against defended American positions. It did not teach this lesson. 3 weeks later, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi stood in the same jungle with 6,000 men and made many of the same assumptions. To understand why the lesson failed to penetrate the institution, it is necessary to examine the specific mechanisms by which the Imperial Japanese Army processed battlefield information in 1942 and 1943. The Senjin-kun, the Field Service Code issued on January 8, 1941 under the authority of War Minister Hideki Tojo, contained a passage that every Japanese soldier had memorized and that defined the psychology of every garrison in the Pacific. It commanded, in translation, never live to suffer the disgrace of being taken prisoner. This was not advice. It was a formal military order. The command meant that every Japanese garrison that was defeated and overrun died in place rather than surrendering. Dead men could not be transported to interrogation centers. Dead men could not describe to their debriefers what the Marines had done that their doctrine had not anticipated. Dead men could not send reports to Imperial General Headquarters demanding revisions to planning assumptions. Dead men could not ask why the Marines had not run when all the calculations said they should have. The code that was meant to produce heroic sacrifice also produced, systematically, the destruction of the very institutional knowledge the Japanese army needed to adapt. Every defeated garrison took its lessons to the bottom of the sea or into ash, and the next commander inherited the same inadequate model of the enemy and made the same category of mistake. The second structural problem was the rigid separation between the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy. The two services operated under separate command structures, separate intelligence networks, and separate doctrinal traditions that had been evolving in different directions since the Meiji era. There was no joint general staff at which the lessons of each campaign could be aggregated into revised doctrine for the next one. When the Navy's special naval landing forces were destroyed at Tarawa in November of 1943, the Army was not institutionally required to incorporate that experience into its own island defense planning. When Army divisions were shattered on Saipan in the summer of 1944, the specific tactical details did not automatically flow to the officers designing the next set of defenses. Each service and each geographic command largely inherited the same fundamental miscalculations and applied them again with minor variations. The Battle of Edson's Ridge in September of 1942 demonstrated this institutional rigidity with what should have been, by any reasonable standard, a decisive and final lesson. Major General Kawaguchi's plan was considerably more sophisticated than Ichiki's. He divided his roughly 6,000 men into multiple attack columns, coordinated timing across separate approach routes through the jungle, and aimed for the ridge south of Henderson Field that offered the most direct approach to the airstrip. His men had raided a Japanese supply base at Tasimboko on September 8th and captured documents including details of Vandegrift's own intelligence analysis. He knew the position he was attacking existed and approximately where it was. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion, combined strength approximately 840 men, had been moved to the ridge on Vandegrift's order after Edson himself predicted the route Kawaguchi would choose. The ridge was prepared, the artillery was registered, and Edson had positioned his men in defense in depth rather than on a single line that could be broken by a single push. Kawaguchi's attack columns failed to converge on schedule because the jungle between the coast and the ridge was deeper, denser, and more disorienting than his maps had indicated. His western force, commanded by Colonel Akinosuke Oka, attacked only after the main effort had already been repulsed and achieved nothing. His flanking battalion assembled too far east and never made contact with the Marine position at all. His central column struck the ridge on the night of September 12th and was met by artillery fire from Colonel Pedro del Valle's 11th Marines at close range, with a density that had no equivalent in Japanese fire support. Doctrine. Kawaguchi lost between 700 and 850 killed in 2 nights of fighting. He survived and sent a message to 17th Army asking, with barely contained anguish, whether the destruction of the Ichiki detachment should not have taught them something. His superiors sent back a reply that dismissed the concern and directed the planning of a third assault. Tarawa, in November of 1943, represented the furthest development of Japanese defensive confidence before experience forced a reckoning. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki had built what he believed was an impregnable position on the tiny island of Betio in the Tarawa Atoll. Approximately 4,800 defenders occupied roughly 500 reinforced concrete and coconut log bunkers connected by trench networks, backed by heavy artillery, and protected on their seaward face by a reef that extended 500 yards offshore and that most landing craft of the period could not cross. Shibasaki reportedly told his staff that 1 million men could not take Betio in 100 years. That was not a boast made for subordinates. It was a genuine tactical assessment, based on the assumption that American landing craft would be stopped at the reef and destroyed in the water before any significant force reached the beach. What the defense could not account for was a converted agricultural tractor. The landing vehicle tracked, developed from a swamp rescue vehicle by inventor Donald Roebling, had been converted by the Marine Corps into an assault transport that could cross coral reefs under its own power. Japanese observers had seen early models of the vehicle at Guadalcanal and classified it as a supply carrier, not a fighting vehicle. They had not anticipated that the Marines would pack it with infantry and send it across the reef at Tarawa as the primary assault vehicle. When 125 of them began crossing the reef on November 20th, 1943, Japanese defenders fired into them at near point-blank range. The vehicles absorbed the fire and kept moving. They climbed the reef, crawled across the shallows, and deposited Marines directly inside the defensive perimeter, bypassing the killing zone the entire Japanese defensive plan depended upon. Shibasaki was killed by naval gunfire near his command post on the first day of the battle. Communications collapsed, and the coordinated counterattack his plan required never happened. In 76 hours, the 2nd Marine Division destroyed the garrison. Of approximately 4,836 defenders, 4,690 were killed, and 17 surrendered. The Marine Corps did not celebrate this victory without examining what had nearly gone wrong. The post-battle report catalogued every failure in naval gunfire timing, every communication breakdown between ships and shore, and every case where the defense held positions that pre-invasion planning had assumed would be destroyed. The document drove immediate institutional changes. Armored versions of the landing vehicle with direct fire guns were ordered for the next amphibious operation. Rocket-firing gunboats were added to suppress beach defenses during the final approach. Naval gunfire doctrine was revised from area suppression to deliberate destruction of individual targets, a change driven by the analysis of Lieutenant Colonel Donald Weller, which showed that neutralization fire was far less valuable than destruction fire that removed defenders permanently. Joint assault signal companies were created to integrate communications between ships, aircraft, and infantry simultaneously, solving the radio coordination failures that had cost lives at Tarawa. Underwater demolition teams were organized to clear obstacles before the assault waves arrived. The Marines treated every failure as a technical problem, with a solvable solution, and applied the solution before the next beach. This was not a natural organizational reflex. It required an institutional culture that treated bad news as information rather than as embarrassment, and that had been building that culture since the 1920s. Japanese garrisons that defeated the Marines at the waterline would have won the battle of attrition Japan needed. Japanese garrisons that learned from each Marine assault and improved their defenses for the next one might have delayed the Pacific advance by months or years. Neither happened, because the Senjin-kun Code and the institutional separation between services ensured that the men with the most accurate knowledge of what Marines actually did under fire were always already dead by the time anyone could ask them. On Saipan, between June 15th and July 9th, 1944, the Japanese defensive system that had never accounted for marine adaptability reached the limit of its endurance. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito's garrison had been depleted before the battle began by American submarines that sank the transport ships carrying replacement troops and equipment. The American victory in the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th and 20th destroyed Japanese carrier aviation and permanently cut the island off from reinforcement or resupply. With no prospect of relief and a defensive perimeter forced back step by step across the island's rugged interior, Saito made his final decision on the morning of July 6th. He composed a farewell address, acknowledging that no material remained with which to continue fighting, and that whether his men attacked or held their ground, death was the only outcome. He committed ritual suicide in his cave. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the officer who had commanded the carrier force that struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, killed himself nearby the same morning. In the hours before dawn, on July 7, 1944, approximately 3,000 to 4,300 Japanese survivors, some carrying nothing but bamboo spears, assembled and launched what has remained in the historical record as the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. The assault struck 2 American battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment of the 27th Division in a wave that surviving officers described as unlike anything they had encountered. The Japanese penetrated approximately 1,000 yards before being annihilated by concentrated artillery, machine guns, and rifle fire. Approximately 4,300 Japanese died in and around the assault. Total Japanese military dead on Saipan reached roughly 29,000 of approximately 31,000 defenders. American casualties totaled 16,525, including 3,426 killed. The fall of Saipan brought down the government of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo on July 18, 1944. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa on Peleliu had already arrived at conclusions, the new defensive guidelines formalized. He had studied the previous campaigns and understood that the pattern of beach defense, followed by banzai charge, had produced only one kind of result. His force of roughly 10,700 men on the island turned the Umobrugol ridgeline into approximately 500 interconnected limestone caves, reinforced with steel blast doors, ventilation systems, and reverse-slope fighting positions that allowed defenders to withdraw from one position to another without exposure. He sighted his artillery to fire from covered positions that naval gunfire could not easily reach. He told his men there would be no counterattacks, no mass charges, and no attempt to destroy the Americans in the first hours. They would make the Marines pay for every yard. When the 1st Marine Division landed on September 15, 1944, the commanding general predicted the battle would last 2 days, perhaps 3. It lasted 73. Colonel Louis Puller's 1st Marines lost approximately 1,749 casualties of roughly 3,000 men in 6 days of fighting in the Umobrugol ridges before being relieved by Major General Roy Geiger over Puller's explicit objections. Total 1st Marine Division casualties reached approximately 6,500 men. The Army's 81st Infantry Division took over the siege of the remaining Japanese pocket on October 15th and required 6 more weeks to end the resistance. Nakagawa sent his final radio message on November 24, 1944. "Our sword is broken, and we have run out of spears." He burned his regimental colours and died. Approximately 10,695 of his roughly 11,000 men were dead. Nakagawa's defence had, in a tactical sense, worked exactly as designed. The Marines had paid an unprecedented price for the ground. The temperature on the Umobrugol ridges in September and October of 1944 regularly exceeded 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Water had to be carried by hand to forward positions. Men who survived the fighting often did not survive the heat and dehydration. Nakagawa had designed his defense to exploit every disadvantage the terrain and climate imposed on an attacking force, and he had succeeded. But the Marines had answered his cave system with a method he had not anticipated. The combination of Browning automatic rifle suppression, engineer demolitions teams, and flamethrower operators working from close range, which Marines called the corkscrew and blowtorch method, had been refined across the weeks of fighting in the Umabrogol until it functioned as efficiently as any industrial process. Armored amphibious vehicles mounted with long-range flamethrowers fired thickened fuel into cave mouths from 150 yards. Armored bulldozers sealed entrances while Japanese soldiers remained inside. Aircraft applied napalm to burn vegetation from ridge faces before ground teams moved in. The 13-man rifle squad with 3 4-man fire teams, standardized across the Marine Corps by headquarters in May of 1944, provided the density of automatic fire this method required to work safely. That squad structure had been developed during the war itself, shaped by the combat experience of the raiders and refined through repeated amphibious operations, and it was now the foundation of every assault on every defended ridge in the Pacific. The one Japanese commander who came closest to understanding what he was facing had spent more time in the United States than any other senior officer of his generation. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi, assigned to defend Iwo Jima in the summer of 1944, had served as assistant military attaché at the Japanese embassy in Washington from 1928 to 1930, then from 1930 to 1933 as Japan's first military attaché to Canada in Ottawa. He had traveled across the United States by automobile, observed American industry, read American newspapers, and written letters home to his wife and children that were later published in Japan as a book. In those letters, he described the United States as a nation of enormous material power and genuine national will. Before departing for Iwo Jima, he wrote to his wife that the United States was the last country in the world Japan should have chosen to fight. On Iwo Jima, he applied every accumulated lesson of the previous campaigns. He formally prohibited banzai charges. He relieved several senior subordinates who argued against his defensive doctrine. He supervised the excavation of approximately 11 miles of interconnected tunnels beneath the volcanic rock of the island, some installations built to 7 levels below the surface, with piped water, ventilation, electricity from diesel generators, and food storage sufficient for months of siege. He registered 300 anti-aircraft guns, 438 artillery pieces, and 69 anti-tank guns to cover every approach across terrain that offered attacking infantry almost no cover. He issued personal orders requiring each defender to kill 10 Marines before dying. His calculation was precise and unsentimental. He believed that if he could sustain American casualties beyond a threshold, the American public would find politically intolerable. Political pressure would force a negotiated end before the invasion of the Japanese home islands. It was a plan built on the one assumption every Japanese commander shared, that American will was the soft variable, the thing that could be broken if the price was made high enough. The flaw in that assumption had been visible since the sandbar at Alligator Creek, but no one in the Japanese High Command had yet accepted what it meant. At 9 in the morning on February 19, 1945, armored amphibious vehicles carrying the initial assault waves of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions came ashore on the volcanic black sand of the beaches Kuribayashi had designated for maximum destruction. He waited for the beaches to fill with men and vehicles before opening fire. What followed was described by every surviving officer who experienced it as the most concentrated and precisely directed defensive fire they had encountered in 4 years of Pacific warfare. Approximately 550 Marines died on the first day alone. Over the following 5 weeks, the battle consumed 6,821 Marines and sailors, killed and produced 19,217 additional wounded, making it the bloodiest single engagement in the history of the Marine Corps. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded to participants, 22 to Marines, and 5 to Navy corpsmen who served alongside them, more than for any single battle in American military history. Kuribayashi was posthumously promoted to full general by Imperial General Headquarters, the highest recognition his government could offer. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz's tribute to the men who fought on Iwo Jima, composed after the battle was secured, has never been improved upon. Uncommon valor was a common virtue. Kuribayashi extended what American planners had projected as roughly a 1-week campaign to 36 days. He imposed casualties that shook American public confidence in a way no previous Pacific battle had done. and yet his fundamental calculation was wrong. He had assumed the Marines would stop advancing when casualties reached a threshold. His experience told him no Western army could absorb. They did not stop. He had not modelled the 8 POA CWS H-1 flame tanks pooled between the 4th and 5th Tank Battalions, described by Japanese survivors in post-war accounts as the single weapon most responsible for driving defenders from their caves. He had studied Americans in Washington and Ottawa in peacetime. He had not studied Marines under fire, and the distinction turned out to matter more than any other single factor in his plan. Approximately 18,000 of Kuribayashi's 21,000 men died on the island during the 36 days of fighting. 216 prisoners were taken during the battle itself. Organized resistance ended in late March of 1945. Individual holdouts continued to emerge for months afterward. The last 2 Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima surrendered in January of 1949, more than 3 years after the battle ended. 2 men who had been given every reason by their institution to believe that surrender was impossible had, eventually, chosen survival. It was the quietest possible refutation of the doctrine that had sent them there. The men who survived the Pacific campaigns and returned to Japan after the formal surrender carried their knowledge of what had happened in fragments, many of them in a silence that lasted for decades. The Japanese military had been so thorough in suppressing public awareness of how its men died and why its strategies had failed, that for years after the war, many families had no accurate account of the circumstances that had killed their final sons and husbands. Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, Chief of Staff of 32nd Army on Okinawa, left a formal written statement before committing suicide on June 22, 1945. He wrote that every strategy, tactic, and technique available to his army had been employed to its maximum, and that it had been as nothing against the material strength of the enemy. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the operations officer of 32nd Army and one of the very few senior Japanese officers to survive Okinawa, having been ordered by his commander to live and bear witness rather than die with the garrison, published a memoir in Japanese in 1973 that was translated into English in 1995. His conclusion was direct. Japan had never had a chance on Okinawa. The decision to fight a conventional defensive campaign against American industrial firepower and logistical reach had been determined to fail by factors that existed before the first Marine stepped ashore. Thomas Huber's study of Japan's Battle of Okinawa, published by the United States Army Command and General Staff College in 1990 as part of the Leavenworth Papers series, concluded that by the final campaigns, the Imperial Japanese Army faced an adversary with more firepower than itself, on limited island terrain, and that its operational methods were completely inappropriate to the realities of the Pacific campaign at every level from the tactical to the strategic. The families of Japanese soldiers who died on those islands received news through channels that the army controlled with absolute authority. Men who died in a banzai charge were said to have met a glorious end in service to the emperor. Men sealed in caves by Marine demolitions teams were said to have died defending the sacred soil of the nation. The actual circumstances of those deaths, the doctrinal mispredictions and institutional failures and racial assumptions that had sent those men against an enemy their own government had fundamentally misunderstood, were not discussed in the notifications and were not available in public sources during the war. Families in Hokkaido and Kyushu and Shikoku grieved for sons who had been given a false description of the men who were waiting for them across every sandbar and reef and ridgeline of the Pacific. The historical scholarship that has examined those campaigns has been almost unanimous on the core question. Japanese commanders at every level were undone not by a deficit of courage or tactical intelligence, but by a deficit of accurate information about the specific kind of force they were fighting. The Imperial Japanese Army's intelligence system was built around a model of the enemy, constructed from assumptions about racial and spiritual superiority, and then defended against revision by the same institutional pressures that made banzai charges seem rational and surrender unthinkable. The more information that came in contradicting the model, the more the institution found ways to dismiss or discard it. Kawaguchi's warning before Edson's Ridge was dismissed. Tanaka's verdict after Tenaru was noted and filed. The reports of Marine adaptations at Tarawa were processed but not transmitted with sufficient urgency to the garrison commanders preparing the next set of defenses. The institution was not incapable of learning. It was structured in ways that made learning slower than the war's pace required, and the war moved at a pace that did not forgive structural slowness. The memorials built on the battlefields in the decades since the war ended, on Guadalcanal, on Tarawa, on Saipan, on Peleliu, on Iwo Jima, are maintained by the governments of both nations and visited by the aging families of the men who died on all sides. The ceremonies held on those islands each year are quiet events attended by people who have had to make peace with the particular nature of a loss that could not be explained by the language available at the time it happened. The numbers at those ceremonies decline each year as the surviving veterans pass away and their children take up the responsibility of memory without the weight of personal experience to anchor it. What those ceremonies share across every island, regardless of which flag the attendees carry, is the common fact of young men who were sent somewhere by institutions that had decided what those men would find waiting for them, and who discovered that the institutions had been wrong. The story of why Japanese soldiers could not predict United States Marines is not, in its deepest sense, a story about courage or ferocity, or fighting skill on either side. Both forces possessed those qualities in abundance, and demonstrated them throughout the 3.5 years the war lasted in the Pacific. It is a story about what happens to an institution that builds its operational planning on assumptions it cannot revise, without threatening the cultural foundations on which the entire organization rests. The Senjinkun prohibition on surrender, the faith in spiritual force over material superiority, the racial confidence that American will would fracture under sustained casualties, and the hierarchical command structure that prevented bottom-up tactical innovation were not accidental features of the Japanese military. They were deliberate choices made over generations by serious men who believed those choices would produce victory. The choices were wrong. The war tested them against reality, battle by battle, island by island, and reality did not yield. What made the failure so complete was not that Japan lacked intelligent officers. Kawaguchi had recognized the problem in 1942. Kuribayashi had studied the enemy more carefully than any Japanese general of his generation. The failure was systemic. It was built into the way information flowed, the way defeat was classified, and the way the institution defined the relationship between its own doctrine and the evidence that contradicted it. The Marines adapted because their culture had been built, deliberately and over 2 decades, around the understanding that the enemy you plan to fight and the enemy you actually encounter are almost never identical, and that the institution capable of surviving that gap is the one that has prepared for the gap rather than for the plan. The sandbar at Alligator Creek held no glory for anyone who crossed it that night. But it holds a lesson that every institution in any field eventually encounters in some form. The cost of a model that cannot be corrected is paid not by the model, but by the men who trusted it. Colonel Ichiki had written the ending of his battle before it began. He had studied warfare, studied his enemy, and had arrived at a prediction so certain that he wrote it in his diary as fact. What his doctrine gave him no language to write was the possibility that the men across that sandbar had prepared for precisely the moment he chose to charge, that they had been preparing for it for more than 20 years, and that they would still be there when he was gone.